Hello, everybody. My name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program, When Detroit Played the Numbers. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page and on the RHPL website shortly after. We ask the audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation. We'd also like to thank the Friends of the Rochester Hills Public Library and their many fundraising efforts. It's thanks to their support that we can provide wonderful programming like tonight's presentation. Our next program is AI Unleashed, Practical Tips for Everyday Success, which will be an in-person event on Thursday, September 26th at 7 p.m. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. Now, without further ado, please welcome our presenter, Felicia George.
Okay. Oh, there it goes. Okay. Good evening, and thank you guys so very much for allowing me to come to talk about something that I find fascinating, that's near and dear to me. So before I always start this, I always like to ask the question, who can tell me what playing the numbers is? It's the lottery. What else? It's gambling. Okay. Pretty much it. It is a game of chance. It is a type of lottery. Today's Michigan Daily 3 is a carbon copy of it. It actually duplicated, and it took its role from this. But before we start talking about the playing the numbers, we have to kind of look, clicker doesn't want to work. We have to kind of look at, I think it did the pop-up thing. Is this not touchscreen? It's not. Okay. Perfect. I'll just do it like that. I'll just answer like that. Perfect. Got it. All right. So before we start talking about the numbers, we first have to go over a little history. So first there was the lottery. And we brought the concept of lottery over from England when the United States was forming. And citizens love the lottery. They love the lottery because they kind of like the entertainment of it. But more importantly, the lottery built America. We used it to pay for churches, bridges, buildings, schools, you name it, that's what was used from lottery proceeds. And citizens loved it because it meant they didn't have to be taxed. It was a fast, easy way to raise lots and lots of money. So from 1868 to 1892, it was legal in the United States. And what's significant about the first part of 1868 is this is after the Civil War. And Louisiana was struggling just a little bit. And a company went to them and they said, hey, state of Louisiana or Louisiana Territory, we have a solution for your money problems. If you let us run our lottery exclusively through Louisiana, you guys will make lots of money. And Louisiana said, ooh, do tell. We're very interested in making lots of money. And so that is what happened. So the first initial lotteries were in Louisiana. And there was a lot of pomp and circumstance that went around how these lotteries took place, the drawings. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about when it's finally legalized again here in Michigan. So they would have the Confederate generals from the Civil War would sit on the stage. They would have two young black men pull numbers. They would then take the numbers and they would give it to Southern belles that were in beautiful gowns. And then they would take it and they would post it up. And it was all of this, pageantry. And everybody was just fascinated with it. But one thing about us in America, what do we like saying? We've got that good old Protestant work ethic, right? We believe in pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. We don't get anything for nothing. And so that kind of really started bothering the church and started bothering some of the masses about this whole lottery thing. But what really soured people on the lottery was fraud. Fraud started slowly creeping into it. So people were not getting paid. When they were, sometimes it wasn't what they were supposed to get. Sometimes they would up and leave. And so slowly but surely, the citizens of America became soured on them. And one by one, states started making them illegal. And so one of the things that they started doing, initially here in Detroit, it started picking up. And what was happening was you have to figure out a way how everybody can afford a lottery ticket. That way you can make more money, right? So they went from just having a lottery where you could buy a full ticket. If you were poor, you could buy partial tickets. And with these partial tickets, if one of your numbers were drawn, you were guaranteed that you would win some kind of money. And so sometimes people say, well, where did the term policy come from? Because before we talk about numbers, there was policy, and that's where it came from. And so this was a way for the poor to be able to play these lotteries. So as the states started making these illegal, policy shops were still taking place throughout America. And you have to remember, in Louisiana, it stayed legal until 1892. So they would use the drawings from the Louisiana lottery to keep these policy shops going. So these were headlines that were in the Detroit Free Press back in 1880. And this is a quote that's really interesting. He says, there's very few coons in Detroit that don't play policy. I'm telling you, and then again, there's as many white folks into it as coons. This is in 1880 again. What they started doing was, once the fraud leaked in here and it became something that was really, really something that was not desired, they had to make it where it was not welcome, where it was vilified, and where people would no longer play. And so you start seeing a whole lot of stories, these tales of caution that would jump up and tell things like this. Oh my goodness, this poor man worked his whole life to save money to buy a homestead. And his crazy wife, she got crazy on policy, and what did she do? She spent all of his money, and it drove him insane, and now he's in an insane asylum. Or it made him commit suicide. And these were stories that were ran in the paper all the time to discourage people from playing the lottery. So in Detroit, at this point, past the 1880s, it is illegal. And so they started really looking, and this is when you start seeing the vilification. We're going to link it to something that's not good. We had black people who were playing it, and they're just giving up all their spare change. They're too superstitious. There are all kinds of bad things about policy. But by 1908, the Detroit Police Department declared that the illegal policy shops were dead in Detroit. At that point in time, there may have been one of two, but for the most part, they were not large-scale ran at all. And then steps in this man. This is John Roxborough, and the name may sound familiar to some people that are history buffs. His claim to fame is he was Joe Louis's manager. But John Roxborough came from a privileged family. His father was an attorney in Louisiana. He was born in 1892, right when the lottery was becoming illegal in Louisiana. And his father was an attorney, his mom was a teacher, and they came from Louisiana to Detroit like a lot of blacks, looking for better opportunities. So they moved to Detroit. They live on the north end, bordering Hamtramck. The father practices law. He runs a weekly black newspaper. He ends up dying in his 50s quite young. But there was an expectation for John and his four brothers. And the expectation was they were to become educated. They were supposed to go to college. One brother did. He became an attorney, became Michigan's first black senator. But John took a different route. Initially, he started off in college, and he got frustrated. He said, you know what? Why am I going to school to be an attorney? And I know that once I graduate, I am not going to be able to find a job as an attorney because I'm black. I do not want to spend time on an education, and all I can do is become a porter. So he dropped out of college, and he first started working for the post office. And if you know anything, you know at that time period, if you had a job with the post office, that was a really, really good job. That was a prestigious job. And so he was a clerk in the post office for a number of years. And then he went over to Wayne County, became a clerk there for a few years, and then he became a bail bondsman. Now, remember, he comes from an influential family. He's got these good jobs, right? So he becomes a bail bondsman, and this is in 1918, 1919. And he meets a man who is a Kansas City policy operator. He's the biggest policy operator in Kansas City. And John has to go bail him out. And him and the man begin to speak and talk about, what it was that he did. And he says, you know what? I cannot believe you squares here in Detroit do not have policy shops. He said, what are you talking about? He said, gambling. All of you people here in Detroit are attracted here to make all this money in all these industries. The money's here, the people are here, and you do not have policy shops. If you start a policy shop, I'm telling you right now, you're going to become very rich. And so John, like the state of Louisiana, said, ooh, do tell, do tell. So he spent time with him, and he taught him the ins and outs of how to start this policy operation in Detroit, and became very, very popular. This is a man that comes from a family of privilege, right? So people trusted him. And trust is a huge part of any kind of gambling organization. So John starts running it. He's making a lot of money. He gets a partner. His partner name is Everett Watson, and they're making all kinds of money. And at this time, we're talking about the early 1920s. They're running these policy shops. But there were some problems with policy. Policy was very complicated to understand the rules. It depended on who was running it. So you could draw either 12, 24, or 36 numbers. And all the numbers ranged from 1 to 78. And you see the guy that's holding the sack in his hand. In his right hand, he's got this little rubber capsule. And in that capsule is a number. And what they would do is they would either put it in a barrel, like the one to the left, or they put it into that sack. And they would draw out those 12, 24, or 36 numbers. And you could make money off if you bet 3 and you got them right. You bet 1, you would win something. So a penny bet on a single number got you a quarter. That was pretty good, right? A nickel bet on a gig, which was 3, got you $10. But it was very labor intensive. You had to have somebody to draw the numbers. You had to have witnesses to see that the number was really being drawn. Then you had to have a way to communicate to the people what was the winning numbers. And those are what these slips are right there. Those are the winning policy numbers that were pulled. Then you would have to have somebody deliver the money, the winnings to people. And so it was very, very, very labor intensive, but it was very profitable. So this went on to probably about 1927. And right before that, in New York, there was a man named Casper Halston. Casper was a janitor, and he was from the islands, and he would spend a lot of time reading newspapers. And one of the things that fascinated him was the clearinghouse. The clearinghouse simply told what the closing figures were for the banks for a given day. And he noticed that that number always changed. And he said, you know what? He had a policy shop on the side. He said, I think we can come up with a better game, and we'll simply call it the numbers. People will bet 3, we'll pick 3 numbers, and based on what they pick on the clearinghouse, we'll tell you if you're a winner or not. So New York used the clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse figures, those first 3 digits behind the decimal point was the winning number. But here in Detroit, we got to be a little different. So Detroit, when John Roxborough brought this to Detroit and introduced it to the black community, they decided they were going to use horse racing tracks. And the power came from whoever was the one who determined what racetrack was going to be used. And John Roxborough was the one who determined what that racetrack was. So right here, this is a policy ticket. And I have one, I'm going to pass one around too, just so you can see it, because it's a little bit clearer on this. That is a policy ticket. You see at the bottom it says B4? That stands for Big 4. That was John Roxborough's house. Next to that, you see it says 3RA. That means the person was betting the first 3 races. Then you see the number 801. That's their number. There's a box around it. That box means that they boxed it, that any combination of that number that failed, be it 801, 108, 018, they were a winner. And they bet either $10 or 10 cents. I'm thinking probably 10 cents. This was in 1937. So it's really important to see that date as well, because you had to be looking at the right mutuals paid. So the Detroit Free Press, the Detroit News, the Detroit Times, they would print the mutuals paid for races. And this is how they found out what the winning number was. It was the first number in front of the decimal point. So this person played the first 3 races, so we're going to look at 1, 2, 3 races, and the winning number was 874. So this makes it a little clearer. This one right here is another ticket. This is the Yellow Dog. Each different company had their own name, and that's how you knew who you were playing with. So that was the Big 4. The Yellow Dog was his partner, Everett Watson, before they had a fallen out and separated ways. But that was how it was. And if you put a nickel bet on that, you won $25 if it fell straight. That's not a good money. So before I go into this, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of the numbers in Detroit. At this point in time, it was something that was in the black community. This is something that they ran. Every community across the United States that had a large black population tend to have either a policy shop or a numbers organization. At this time, when they first started doing this, especially here in Detroit, because Detroit was very different than Chicago and New York. In Chicago and New York, you saw a violent overthrowing of who ran those numbers organizations from the mafia. And what happened was in Detroit, when this first started out, the mafia really wasn't in it. You know, everybody kind of laughed like penny nickel bets, and there's no money in that. And so when Prohibition ended, they were like, we need to find a way to make up that money that we're losing. That's one. But two, they also realized there was big money to be made in it. And I'm gonna give you an example. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, and banks didn't have money, the numbers men had money. They had lots and lots and lots of money. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you about a scandal that happened. And this is going to tell you how many people that they hired to work in their organizations. It was not as labor intensive as policy shops, but it still required them to have a lot of people working for them. You had to have somebody that was a numbers writer that would go around and take people's number, go from house to house. And those numbers writers were really important. They became, think of them as lobbyists before they were lobbyists. They were the ones, they were the town criers that spread gossip, that whatever needed to happen, and politically they were very, very powerful. Whatever the numbers men wanted them to push politically, they were the ones that did it because they had the relationships with the people in the community. So you had to have those. You had to have bad men that collected all that stuff and took it to the headquarters. In the headquarters, you had to have cashiers. You had to have check men and women. You had to have a manager who managed that. You needed accountants to keep track of the money. And if your people was caught and went to jail, you had to have a bail bondsman and you had to have attorneys. So these numbers men hired blacks that became accountants and lawyers who would not have probably been hired anyplace else save for those communities. During that time, housing for black people was really, really tight. It was tight for everybody, but it was really tight if you were black. Those numbers men were the ones who actually literally built houses when nobody else would build them. When you couldn't get a loan for a business, it was them who stepped up who did it. When you had somebody that you thought was promising and you wanted to send them to school, they sent hundreds of kids to college and they paid for it. These men were the men who stepped up when the NAACP, the Urban League were hurting. They were the ones who gave them the money so that they could keep operating. When the Great Depression hit, it was them who fed the hungry, who made sure that thousands of kids had some kind of Christmas because they were making that kind of money. Think of this as corporate social responsibility before we knew the term corporate social responsibility. They knew they had to take care of their community because if they did, the community took care of them. So you had this relationship of, okay, we depend on each other. So this is going on. Money is being made. And then all of a sudden, the mafia finds out about it and it goes, we want some of this money. So in 1929, Charles Bowles is elected mayor of Detroit. And he was elected with the help of the Ku Klux Klan. Klan had some strong power spots throughout the city, and they backed him. It took him a couple times. He tried to run, wasn't successful, but eventually in 1929, he was elected. And he was elected on a law and order platform. So he told the community, I'm gonna clean up this vice. And they were like, yeah, all right. Yeah, he lasted 6 months before he was recalled. And the reason why he was recalled was because he got upset with his police chief. His police chief decided to do a bunch of raids on the numbers houses, and he didn't get his boss's permission. Because what happened was Charles Bowles had made a deal with the Jewish mafia. The Jewish mafia, at this point, they had started running their own numbers business. And what you found was, once the mafia got in it, whether it was the Italians or Jewish or the Irish, they tended to stay in their own neighborhoods. The ethnic groups, each one started building and having their own clientele. But Roxborough was the one who still had that power because he chose the racehorses. He controlled the wire service. But each one stayed in their own lane. Well, when Charles Bowles came, one of the Jewish mobsters, he had decided he wanted to take over a bigger share. He wanted to get into the black community as well. So the first thing he did was he hooked up with another black numbers operator. And for a while they were running numbers, but the neighborhoods really didn't like them because if somebody hit big, they wouldn't pay. And so this caused a little bit of friction. John Roxborough had the reputation of being honest, always paying on time with new money. He would be down in the community. And so the relationship was a little different. So when the Jewish mafia said, hey, we're taking over, they called all the black numbers operators together, they called some of the Italians together, and they told them, we're now in charge. And they said, yeah, Roy, no, you're not, I don't think so. And I'm gonna tell you where they got their power from. And so when they recalled Charles Bowles, their plan to take over went flat because now they did not have the police to help strong arm taking over the numbers operation. Why John Roxborough had so much power and influence was simply Joe Louis. Joe Louis is the biggest probably thing that he contributed. He knew, and he said this when he was growing up, he said, you know what, one day I am going to make it. And when I make it, I'm going to take care of myself, but I'm also going to take care of my race. And he had a plan. He was really into sports. He played basketball. And he had this idea that he was going to champion and find a young man that would be a champion. And he ended up doing just that. He saw Joe Louis fighting one day. They ended up forming a relationship, became really, really close. And the next thing you know, Joe Louis is heavyweight champion of the world. So he has this power and this influence because Joe Louis is this American hero. That's one. Two, he has money. And with money comes power. Three, you know that political savvy I was talking about, those lobbyists that ran in the neighborhood? They would go to the candidates and say, hey, look, we're going to donate X amount of money to your campaign. And not only are we going to give you money for your campaign, we are going to have the black vote for you. And what he would do is he would tell his numbers writers, when you're out there writing those numbers, you tell them we're voting for Richard Reedy. That's who we're throwing our hat behind. And in return, they would give the mayor bribes. The mayor agreed to hire black police officers because at this time it was really, really hard in the black community. There were very few black police officers, and police brutality was something that was talked a lot about in the black community. And so he was using this leverage to try to bring those resources to the community, and it worked. And so Richard Reedy, with the lobbying and the help of a lot of numbers operators, became the next mayor of Detroit a couple of years after Charles Bowles. So everything comes to an end. But before I talk about this end that comes, I want to talk about why people played. People played numbers for a lot of reasons. The most obvious is one, you want to win, right? But they also play for entertainment. They like the challenge of it. So for some people, it became a habit. But for a lot of people, it was socialization. It was a time for them to get with their neighbors, to talk about what number you played, what number fell, what was your dream. And we're going to talk about dream books in a second. But they also use it as a support system. There are some people, they didn't care about the numbers. They didn't need to play the numbers. But they knew what the numbers meant to the community. And so they patronized them for that reason. So people used a lot of strategies in picking their numbers. Some, said, I'm going to rely on luck. Some were higher power players, meaning they went to that Bible to get those numbers from the Bible to figure out what to play. Some of them went to some of the preachers and got numbers from preachers. Some were hunch players. Hunch players are ones, you went to the store and your total came out to $1.23 and you're like, oh my goodness, that is what's going to fall, $1.23. Then you had people that were convinced they had the system, that they had figured out how the numbers were going to fall. But my favorite way people really played were with dream books. Anybody know what dream books are? Yeah, okay. So got a couple dream books over there. My favorite dream book is the Three Wise Men Dream Book. And the Three Wise Men Dream Book was actually put together by a man whose name was Mallory Banks. Mallory Banks lived on the west side of Detroit on Scott Street. And the funny thing about dream books is nobody really knows where the numbers come from. Each one is different. So if you've got the Three Wise Men, the Red Devil, none of them say the same thing. So Cat may play for 2, 4, 6 in one, and another may play for 509. And I would always ask people, okay, we don't know where the numbers come from. Each one is different. How do you know which one you want to follow? And they would just say, you just got to believe in your dream book, and that's the one you stick with. I'm like, okay. So I like this because a Detroiter put it together. But not only did he come up with this dream book, he was smart enough to copyright it. And so he copyrighted this in the 20s before anybody really thought about it. And so what would happen is the numbers men would give out the dream books and then set up the people to play. They would make it available. And Mr. Banks found out about it. And he said, oh, really? Y'all are copying my dream books and giving them out. Okay. So he took them to court and he sued them. There was 6 numbers operators that he sued for $10,000 each. Eventually what happened is they all settled out of court with him. For how much, we're not sure. But he made a nice little penny because he was smart enough to copyright that dream book. So I'd already talked to you a little bit about the importance of what it did for the community. Hired hundreds of people to work in a numbers organization. Great Lakes Mutual Insurance Company was formed. And the reason why it was formed was because blacks at one point did not have access to affordable insurance. They invested $20,000 in Detroit Owl. That was a weekly newspaper, and later on the Detroit Tribune was actually paid for with money from the numbers. And that was important because in the black community, you didn't really have the mainstream newspapers carrying news as what was going on in your community. Sent a bunch of people to college known to pass out food, toys, donate money to worthy causes, and as I already said, really influenced politics. The greatest thing he did was to be able to create this image of Joe Louis, and that's exactly what he did. Joe Louis was a brilliant fighter, but he wasn't the smartest or sharpest knife in the drawer. Roxborough made sure that he got him tutoring, that he had rules for him, things that he was allowed to say and not allowed to do. He crafted the image so that Americans would see him as an American and not as a black man. And with that came power. So when Joe Louis was drafted into the military, before he was drafted into the military, the Navy at one point would not allow blacks to do anything but be cooks in the Navy. And so Roxborough said, okay, I know how we're going to fix this. They did a charity boxing match for the Navy Relief Society. And the Navy Relief Society took care of the widows and children of men that had died during World War II. And he donated 100% of his purse to the Navy Relief Society. He got a lot of heat from the black community, said, why would you give that to them? And they won't even let us join the Navy. But it so embarrassed the Navy that at that point they changed who they allowed to enlist into the Navy. When he was in the Army, he refused to fight at any base that had segregation in it. He had a hotline straight to the White House, and he would call and complain a lot about unrest that were going on in the Army at that time. But one of the things that numbers people really had to be careful of when they're running these organizations were a couple of things. So first, we talked about already the Jewish invasion that tried to take place in 1929. Then the Italian mafia came in, but they had a gentleman's agreement. A lot of that came because of the power of John Roxborough. So the organizations ran side by side, and they would change in a few years, and I'll tell you how in a minute. But one of the biggest things they had to do was bribe politicians. That was a strategy to stay in business. So if you bribe the mayor, guess what? He's going to make sure that the police don't mess with you. If you bribe the police chief, guess what? He's going to make sure you don't get raided. If you bribe the Wayne County prosecutor, which they did, he's not going to take cases that come your way. And what was really interesting about the county prosecutor, he years before in 1934 had joined the Black Legion. And I like to say his name was Duncan McCrae. He was the original Teflon Don. He could not get in trouble. So they exposed that he was a part of the Black Legion, which was a spinoff of the KKK. And he's laughing, holding up the paper that has a headline, said he's a member of it. And he's like, oh, I joined by mistake. And the voters were like, oh, okay, he joined by mistake. So he got away with a lot of things, but in a minute, he's going to get caught up in something. But one of the things they also had to worry about was being robbed. And that's because they had large amounts of money, and everybody knew it. So if I rob you and you're doing something illegal, you can't report me. So they were robbed a lot. This lady here is Ida Watson. She was the wife of Everett Watson. And a lot of times we forget that women were really, really driving forces behind a lot of things. So this is in the late 1930s, 1940s. When her husband was tied up with his legitimate businesses, because he had a number of legitimate businesses, it was her that actually ran the Yellow Dog Numbers house. When he ended up going to prison, and we're going to talk about that in a second, it was her that ran his legitimate business. And that was unheard of for a woman to have that kind of power and to be in businesses like she was. But she was a force to be reckoned with. So here we go. All good things must come to an end. And I always joke and say they always want to blame it on women. But in this case, it was a woman. So the lady to the left, standing next to the beautiful little girl, is Janet McDonald, her daughter, Pearl. And Janet was a divorcee. Pearl was 10, 11 years old. And Pearl stayed with Janet's sister. And what happened was two sisters married two brothers. And so Janet started working at the Great Lakes Mutual Numbers Operation, which was an Irish numbers house. And she was a secretary. And this guy that's right here, his name is William McBride. And they had a romance, and she fell in love with her Billy. And Bill decided he was tired of seeing Janet, and he pretty much gave her a Dear John letter. He said, you know what, I'm low down, I'm no good, you need to find somebody else. But Janet wasn't having it. She was like, no, 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 no. So they went back and forth. They were having a lot of problems. And then one day, she went and picked up her daughter, and they spent the day on Belle Isle. And they said, you know, Janet was kind of quiet, kind of off a little bit on that particular day. And this is in August, 1939. And so she goes and she meets her Billy one last time. She's going to give him one chance to recognize the error of his ways. And she says, Billy, if I can't have you, nobody's going to have you. He said, yeah, right, okay. So then he left and went and hooked up with another woman at a nearby hotel. And that didn't sit too well with Janet. So Janet goes home, she picks up Pearl. She puts Pearl in a vehicle. She runs a hose pipe from the exhaust into the window, and she kills Pearl and commits suicide. But before she did that, she knew where all the bodies were buried because she was a secretary. So she knew where everything was at. So she mailed and planted around her body letters to the FBI, the Michigan State Police, Detroit News, the Detroit Free Press, Detroit Times, anybody else she could think of, because she knew that these guys were on the take. And so she had to expose this, and expose it she did. The Detroit Free Press ran articles on it, and what you see right here is the day after the story hit the news of what happened with her daughter, old Billy there got scared. He knew he was in some trouble. So he took off going south. He got stopped right at the Monroe border here in Michigan. And this is a Lieutenant McCarthy. And him and McCarthy were buddies. One of the things that they would do is they would help get people promoted for money. And a couple of days before this incident happened, they were on a golf course playing golf. So McCarthy goes, we got to go get Bill, and we got to make sure we just squash this. And for a minute, it worked. It got quiet. Nobody really heard about it. But the citizens got upset because they hadn't forgotten about it. And so you had pastors preaching on the pulpit about it. You had people calling the city council saying, or the common council at that point was what it was called. They were calling saying, what is going on with this case? What is going on? So eventually, a one-man grand jury was seated. One-man grand jury was Homer Ferguson. He was a judge. And he started taking a look at all the vice that was going on. He did an investigation, and as a result of his investigation, this is what he found out. 135 people were indicted. A lot of those were police officers. It included John Roxborough, his partner, Everett Watson. It also included the sheriff of Wayne County, the prosecutor, Duncan McCready, I was telling you the tough line down, and as I said, Mayor Richard Reading. What was really interesting was when a one-man grand jury was doing his thing, the Wayne County prosecutor, Duncan McCready, he knew the gig was up, and he was like, oh my goodness, we got to figure out how to stop this. He sent county prosecutors to attack Homer Ferguson's law clerk, and they called the Detroit police. And so you had fighting going on between county prosecutor investigators, the Detroit Police Department, and Wayne County Police, and it ran in the paper forever. So this was a huge scandal that was hitting the papers. So all these people were indicted. They were found guilty. The smart ones actually took a plea. And the ones who took a plea usually end up getting probation, but the ones who fought it were not so lucky. So So John Roxborough, Everett Watson got 2.5 to 5 years in Jackson. Mayor Richard Reading got 4 to 5. Prosecutor Duncan McCrae got 4.5 to 5. And Sheriff Thomas Wilcox got 4.5 to 5 years as well. Now, when this happened, when Janet McDonald committed suicide, there was an article that ran in the paper. They knew that the police were looking at everything, and this was one of the few times that something happened to shut down numbers from taking place. They closed shop. And it was said 20,000 people in the black community did not have a job for that week, 2 weeks, where they were trying to let everything settle down. So that tells you how powerful and how much influence and how many people were connected to make these organizations this kind of money. This hat right here is still located outside of Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy's office. And it is there for a reason. They have it in a case. And this is what former prosecutor William Callahan said. He said, the hat should serve as a reminder that whoever occupies this office should be able to leave with their pride and dignity intact and with the time to put on your hat before you go. So this is a cautionary tale to prosecutors there to always maintain their integrity. But do you guys think that that was the end of numbers in Detroit? No. So this is where it gets really, really convoluted. And the control is now slowly but surely coming out of the black community. At this point, the wire service is no longer controlled by blacks. John Roxborough is in prison. And so the Italian mafia steps up, and now they control the wire service, and that's where the power is at. But at the same time, they were running side by side still. What happened in 1943, this is after the riots that took place in June of that year. The Gotham Hotel was located on John R. and Orchestra Street, and it was a beautiful hotel. And one of the things that was an issue was blacks really did not have nice accommodations to go to stay at. And so after the riot, you start seeing people like, you know what, we want to get out of here, it's a headache. And the owner of the Gotham sold it to John White. And the urban legend is John White was a very, very fair-complected black man. His partner, who really had the money, his name was Irvin Rolle. Irvin had also got caught up and was indicted, but he was smart enough to take a plea, so he only got probation. And he bankrolled and funded them buying the Gotham Hotel. So you've got this beautiful hotel that is now considered a pride of the black race. Thurgood Marshall, who one day would become the Supreme Court justice, he said he had traveled over 40,000 miles before he was ever able to stay at a hotel this nice. This hotel was 9 stories, had 200 rooms. Langston Hughes wrote about it. A lot of famous black musicians, actors, entertainers stayed in the Gotham Hotel. But one thing about it was John White considered himself a race man, making sure that he was going to take care of his community. He paid tuition for a number of his employees. He paid tuition for a number of the neighborhood kids as well. He required his employees to be a part of the NAACP, and he also required that they become registered voters. When the NAACP and Urban League were once again hurting for money, he stepped in to make sure that they were able to continue to do their mission. But what most people didn't know, some knew, there was a hidden purpose to the Gotham. The Gotham became the main headquarters of the numbers operators in Detroit. So up there on that rooftop in the penthouse is where a lot of numbers action was going on. That was really, really important because it made it very hard for law enforcement to get search warrants to go in there and to raid it. And they kept it up on the top floor, and they had security before most people even knew what security was. So they would have a bell system and a light system that if a cop came in there, they would flash lights, they would ring a bell, somebody would automatically go turn off the elevators so that they would have enough time to stash everything and they wouldn't lose money during a raid or a robbery. And so this went on for a number of years. And then urban renewal comes in. That was prime real estate. They were beginning to start seeing a little bit of decrease in people actually staying there as well because at this time, now desegregation had stepped in, and so blacks had more places that they could actually go and stay. But it was located in a prime spot that Wayne State University wanted. They wanted it for a nursing school for dorms. And so eminent domain was proclaimed. They were forced to close in September of 1962. But even though they were closed to guests, they were still doing numbers out of that building. So the police commissioner at the time was coming in, and he was really dealing with a lot of race issues in the city of Detroit. And he would go into the communities, and the black community was like, you know what? You're saying you're here for us. You want to clean up the community. Do something about the Gotham. He said, what are you talking about? He said, they've been running numbers out of the Gotham for years. You guys need to do something about it. And he said, okay. So he got the IRS, because if you can't get anybody for anything, you can always get them from tax evasion. He got the IRS involved, Michigan State Police, and they raided the Gotham on November 9th. What was interesting about it was hundreds of agents that raided this building, but they didn't tell Detroit police until the last minute. And the reason why was because they knew they had some corrupt police officers, and they wanted to make sure they could get in there and raid it. And sure enough, they were. They came in there like an occupying force, and they destroyed the hotel. So as they're doing their raids, they're breaking doors. And this was a beautiful hotel. They had a lot of mahogany wood, stained glass, all kinds of things, and they destroyed it. By 1963, the Gotham was demolished to make room for what Wayne State planned, and they never ended up putting up there to that day. It's just an empty lot. And John White was arrested the day that they raided him and several other numbers men, but he ended up dying before he could go to trial. He died shortly after the Gotham was demolished. So I like to say that period of time was phase 2, where it went from the black community to Italian mafia running it, but we're getting ready to go to phase 3. And so once again, do you think it ended? No. So now it's getting a little bit tight. This is phase 3. The Italian mafia is definitely running things, and they are loving the money that's coming from him. So they decide they want to take over more market share. Like I said, in New York, they took it over. It was violent bloodshed. And they took it over in the 20s. In Chicago, the exact same way, violent bloodshed, 40s and 50s. They took it over from the Jones brothers. Here in Detroit, not so much of the violence. So Ed Wingate was one of the last big-time black numbers operator. He had a relationship with the Italian mafia. It was a love-hate relationship. Sometimes they loved each other. Sometimes they hated each other. Sometimes they loved to hate each other. But he was somebody that was a self-made man. He came from the South up to Detroit, working at Ford. And then somewhere along the line, he got into the numbers business. But before that, he owned a restaurant. He owned taxi cabs. He did all kinds of things before he got in numbers. But when he got in numbers, he really started making big money. He then opened a bunch of legitimate businesses, and one of them was Golden World Records. Golden World Records was a rival to Motown. Berry Gordy eventually bought Golden World Records from him because he was so threatened by him. But that money came from Ed Wingate. Ed Wingate at one point also owned the Algiers Motel, and we all know that's famous for the 1967 riots. They ended up closing it down because it became just a hellhole where prostitution and all kinds of stuff was going on. He owned the 20 Grand Motel, not the club 20 Grand, but the motel. And they ran numbers out of that as well. He was also a huge horseman. So he bred thoroughbreds, he raced them, he did a little bit of everything. But the one thing about Ed Wingate was he didn't have that community cohesion. He really wasn't connected to the community. He really didn't step in and do that whole corporate social responsibility like the other numbers men. And he had a stronger relationship with the mafia. So the mafia decides they want to take over. And they're not going to do it in violent bloodshed. They did it almost like a Wall Street hostile takeover. They were smart. What they did was they paid black numbers employees to leave their people that they worked for, but to bring their clients with them to work for them. And they did this by paying them more money. They controlled the winning number. They had that wire service, so that came to power. But they would do things like change the winning numbers. And they did this for a number of reasons. They did it to increase their profit, but they also did it to bankrupt competition. So if they knew a number was heavily played, they would make sure that was the number that fell, and it would bankrupt you while I'm now getting ready to swallow up your business because you can't afford to hang on. So later on, there's a huge FBI file on them, and it comes to find out, they admitted it. They said, hey, we got to have winners or people don't play. We just don't got to have big winners. So if you ever heard anybody talk about numbers, you'll hear people say there were two numbers at this time. There was the Pontiac number and there was the Detroit number. And when you played the Detroit number, it was fixed. The mafia ran it and they were going to change it, and you were lucky if you would win anything. But if you played the Pontiac number, for whatever reason, they thought that it was unmolested and that there was no fraud with the Pontiac number. Why? Not sure, but that is what they felt. So now we come to May 16, 1972. They had, for years, it had been put on the ballot. You know, people wanted to put it on the ballot. Nope, we're not going to put it on the ballot. Put it on the ballot. Nope, we're not going to put it on the ballot. People wanted it on the ballot to legalize lottery. And they thought, oh, you know what, nobody, okay, whatever. It makes it, and overwhelmingly it is passed. Every county in the state of Michigan voted to legalize lottery. So the vote ended the 137-year ban on lotteries, and it had not been legal here since 1835. One of my favorite pictures is actually the one here. It says the legal numbers man, lottery tickets. In a minute, you're going to see why that's kind of ironic, because the first lottery really was not like numbers at all. But remember I told you to remember us talking about the pageantry that went with the Louisiana lottery? Well, we had the same thing here. So the very first lottery drawing took place at Cobo Hall. They had beautiful women in beautiful gowns. They had cameras there. They had singers, entertainers. They made a big show of pulling the balls out and who was winning. And it was just this great time. But there were some issues with it. They straight up said, you know, we know our lottery is so different from the numbers game, we're not even thinking about competing with them because the numbers are totally different. They have nothing to do with what we do with the lottery. And so this is one of the first lottery tickets from November 24th, 1972, that first drawing. But they had to do something as well. For years, they had vilified people who played the numbers, and so now they had to change that narrative. So it went from you being, you know, irresponsible with money, to you being superstition, to you being ignorant, to you got to be in it to win it. And they came out with these great campaigns. They wanted to make sure that people didn't think that this was a black people thing, that it was something that everybody did, and everybody did do it. Everybody played the numbers. And so they made sure they had these great stories about the immigrant who came to America and got rich. She was the second winner. The first winner was a gentleman that worked at the Chrysler plant, and it was a big deal. He made sure when he won, the first thing he did was to buy one of the brand new Chryslers that rolled off the line. All of these pictures are printed everywhere. They're all in newspaper, and this was great advertisement to get people to keep playing. But they realized something. We're not making money like the numbers. People love numbers for some reason. So in 1977, they came out with the Daily 3, which was a carbon copy of the numbers game. And I ask again, once lottery was legalized, do you think the numbers ended? Illegal numbers? No. They're still played actively in a bunch of plants. And I always tell people all the time, you gotta think about car companies and different manufacturing places. You know, they're like small communities. People sometimes are spending more time with people they work with than they do at home. And so they still thrive in locations and communities like that. But before I end this and turn this over for questions, there are a couple things that I like to always point out about this story. This story is about an American dream. Not necessarily saying it was a right way to do it, because guess what? Playing the numbers was illegal. But this is what some people did to accomplish their American dream. This story is about formal and informal economies. When the formal economy, during the Great Depression and at other times when blacks were blocked out of being able to take mortgages and get loans for businesses, it was the informal economy of the illegal numbers that came in and saved the day. It was about community pride and solidarity, that whole corporate social responsibility, about relationship and reciprocity, making sure that, you know what, I have an obligation to give back to the people who patronize my business. But more importantly, this is a story about hope, because for a nickel, a dime, people for a day could hold on to the hope and a dream about what they would do if they hit it big. And when things got rough, sometimes that's all people had was just that hope. So, this is just a small part of when Detroit played the numbers. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that the illegal numbers are still happening today?
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of impact do you think that that's going to have for the economy?
You know what? It is dwindling so bad. I did a story with NPR, and actually they interviewed a woman who was still running the numbers, and she wasn't in an automotive plant. She still had her loyal customers, and she said herself that when she passed on, she knew it was probably pretty much going to be it, because young people are not picking this up. These were people that were just, the relationship aspect of it was happening. Are there huge competition for the legal lottery? Not so much anymore. So it is something that's kind of dying by the wayside. Yes, ma'am.
You know what possessed you to decide to research this whole area?
So it was actually by accident. So I'm working on my PhD at Wayne State, and I initially was going to look at the drug trade and how much a lot of drug businesses are ran like corporate 500 companies. And so I'm talking to my dissertation chair, and he's just like, okay, that's a little dangerous. Yeah. So we're going back and forth. And somehow I started mentioning about just how it was very similar to the underground informal economy, talking about numbers. And so he says, what are numbers? So I started telling him, explaining it, and he's just fascinated with it. And so by the time I finally explained it to him, because I had been around it growing up, but I really didn't know. I had a favorite, one of my dad's best friends actually was the hugest numbers man in Uniroyal Tire Company before Uniroyal closed down. And I just thought he was the greatest man in the world. He would always give me double mint gum and popsicles, and he was just wonderful. But he was a numbers man. And it wasn't until I got older that I understood what it was that was going on. My husband worked for General Motors, and he was in the plant and would come tell these stories about, oh my goodness, they running these numbers, blah, blah. I'm like, oh. So as I'm explaining this to my chair, he goes, I think that's your story. He said, just think about it, go home, and let's talk about it later. So I went home, and the more I thought about it, I started talking about it with my husband. And I knew I had an end because I had people I knew that would trust me, that would let me interview them, that would tell me their story. And so within 24 hours, I had turned off going, I'm not going to do drugs, I'm really interested in numbers. And that's how it kind of grew. Anything else? Oh. Thank you so much. Oh, no interruption. No. Didn't bother me one iota. Well, if there's not anything else, feel free to kind of look at some of the posters. These are a lot of the first early mafia men in there. One of the things that's really interesting about it, when they decided to really vilify numbers, there was a couple of commissions that the federal government actually called, where they're, the Kavanaugh Commission was one of them, where they're actually compelling these mobsters to come to testify. And what the newspapers did and what the commission did was they pointed out how violent these men were. And so they would print, what their records were, that, they had been arrested for murder, that they had did this, they had did that. But you didn't see that kind of violence in what was going on with the numbers, but it made good selling of newspapers. That's another picture of Janet. And then if you would like to take a look, if you haven't seen the Dream Book, here is the back that actually has the numbers on there. And so what I love about Dream Books, I collect them. The older ones you get, it is things that we no longer use. They're talking about churning, butter, and it's like, who churns butter anymore? And as the books progress, the different words that translate to different numbers slowly change. And so you can pretty much pick up a book and figure out what time period it is just by looking at the book.
How do you find these books you do?
Oh my goodness. So I send my husband to a lot of estate sales. I spend a lot of money on eBay. And it's just a luck of draw sometimes. I mean, at first, it seemed like I could find them everywhere. I would go to secondhand stores, and I'd be like, oh my goodness, these number books. And I actually have several of the, these are actual betting slips. I have those. These are tip sheets. The tip sheets tell you, what was played. And so I would look out finding this stuff. And now it's really dried up. If I'm able to find, anything now, I'm like, oh my goodness. But yeah.
We had one here donated.
Okay.
That they ended up selling and used books there. But it happened to be the day we were sorting books, so we got to sort and read books.
Yeah.
But I knew of them from horse racing.
Horse racing.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you guys so very much. Like I said, I love this, so thank you.